The sea remembers the men who tried to command it. But among all the names whispered over black water and moonless tides, one rises above the others like a phantom crowned in silence. A man whose legend traveled faster than his ship, whose discipline cut deeper than any blade, and whose presence made even seasoned sailors swallow fear like a stone. Before the world trembled at the name Blackbeard, it shuddered beneath the shadow of a different king. This is where his story begins. Not with triumph, not with gold, not with rebellion or glory, but with a storm. A storm so violent that the ocean itself seemed to convulse with fury, hurling walls of water against the fragile wooden world of men. Lightning tore open the heavens with white, merciless claws. The wind screamed like a living thing, desperate to tear the masts from their roots. And somewhere in that chaos, where the sky and sea looked like one endless black mouth, a single moment of human terror was swallowed whole. A ship, a crack of timber, a cry that no one ever heard, but everyone somehow felt. For storms do not merely break ships, they break people, they break futures, and sometimes they drag one life from its rightful path and cast it violently into another. Among the men clinging to the soaked decks of the slave ship Princess was a quiet Welsh sailor named Bartholomew Roberts, a man who cherished order, calm, and the predictable rhythm of navigation. A man who believed the world could be measured by numbers in a ledger, stars in a sky, knots of rope wrapped neatly around a post. But the storm that night cared nothing for his certainty. When dawn finally crawled over the horizon, pale and exhausted, the sea lay strewn with broken spars and shattered hopes. Roberts survived, not from strength, not from courage, but because the sea, in its strange and impartial wisdom, had not reached for him that night. He stood at the rail, staring into the churn of gray and foam, believing the worst was behind him. He was wrong, for the storm had not come to end his life. It had come to unmake it, to hollow out the man he had been, and prepare the vessel he would become. In that fragile quiet after the tempest, Roberts did not yet know that fate was already moving toward him, carried on foreign sails, armed with loaded guns, and commanded by men who had no use for ledgers or order or quiet precision. Men who ruled by fear, men who laughed at death, men who would soon carve his name into history. And somewhere deep within him, beneath the layers of discipline and decency, something stirred. A whisper, faint but persistent, like the first tremor of a coming quake. All storms begin with a single shift in the wind, and on that morning, the wind changed for Bartholomew Roberts forever.
The storm had loosened Roberts's grip on the world he knew, but it was a pair of black sails that would tear him from it completely. Days after the tempest, as the Princess limped along the Guinea coast, a shape rose on the horizon, swift, purposeful, and wrong. Too sleek for a merchantman, too bold for a naval ship, a predator. The crew whispered the name like a sickness they hoped not to catch. The Royal Rover. Her decks bristled with guns. Her rigging was a tangle of scars and repairs, the marks of a ship that survived by daring the world to kill her. And at her prow stood a man whose gaze could strip the courage from any sailor. Howell Davis. pirate captain. He came aboard with the casual ease of a man stepping into his own parlor. No gun raised, no threats shouted, only a cold smile, the kind given not to equals, but to prey. Roberts watched as the pirate crew seized provisions, shackled officers, and robbed the princess of its dignity far more efficiently than any storm. He stood silently, hoping to be overlooked. Davis did not overlook him. He studied Roberts the way one studies a puzzle, intrigued, patient, already imagining how the pieces might fit. A navigator, a man who understood the stars, calm, controlled, intelligent, useful. Davis offered a choice that was not a choice at all. "You will join us," he said, almost gently. "Your skill is worth more to me than your life. Refuse, and my men will decide what becomes of you." There was no malice in his voice, no anger, just simple, undeniable truth. Roberts felt the world tilt beneath him, as if the storm had returned in human form. He looked at the pirates, hard faces, hungry eyes, men already imagining the sport of killing him, and he understood. Survival is not always noble. Sometimes it is simply necessary. He agreed. Not from desire, not from greed, but because even a good man knows when the hour demands surrender. But surrender has a way of planting seeds, seeds that grow into resentment, into resolve, into something far more dangerous than fear. Aboard the Royal Rover, Roberts found himself trapped in a world that offended every part of his discipline. The pirates drank until dawn, gambled until fists flew, squandered ammunition in drunken celebrations, and navigated by instinct instead of charts. To them, freedom meant chaos. To Roberts, chaos was death. So he withdrew, a quiet ghost drifting through their madness. He performed his duties with precision, but kept his thoughts wrapped in iron, observing, calculating, waiting. He saw their weaknesses, their inefficiencies, their lack of order. He saw how easily they could be broken and how easily they could be controlled. And when Howell Davis was killed in a Portuguese ambush, the pirates fell into fear as quickly as they had once fallen into laughter. They shouted, they argued. Some demanded flight, others demanded vengeance. None knew what to do. The ship that had once felt like a beast of prey now trembled like a cornered animal. Roberts, who had spoken hardly a word since his capture, stepped forward. He did not shout, he did not roar. His voice was steady, quieter than the wind, but somehow heavier than the sea. "You are right to fear what comes next," he told them. "A ship without a captain is already a dead man's coffin." The deck fell silent. Men turned. Men listened. He did not promise glory. He did not promise riches. He did not pretend to be one of them. "I did not choose this life, but I choose to survive it. And if I must sail in hell, then hell will learn to obey." Something shifted in the men, a recognition. Not love, not trust, but certainty. Here stood a man who could lead them, a man not ruled by rum or rage, a man who could see the shape of danger before it arrived. They elected him captain, a decision born not of loyalty, but of instinct, the ancient instinct that men feel when they stand near someone who has already stepped beyond fear. That night, Roberts stood alone on the moonlit deck, the weight of the mantle settling upon him like a chain of cold iron. From his pocket, he removed a small silver locket, a quiet relic from a life he no longer belonged to. Inside was the portrait of his sister, Mary.
Her smile was gentle, her eyes were warmth, a world now lost forever. A single tear formed, not for his fate, but for the quiet man he once was, the man who believed in ledgers and stars, the man the sea had chosen to erase. He wiped it away. For kings, even unwilling ones, are not permitted the softness of tears. And so, on that night, beneath the indifferent moon, Bartholomew Roberts buried the last flicker of the man he had been. In his place grew something harder, something sharper, something destined to carve its name into the bones of the ocean. The unwilling king had taken the throne, and the world would soon tremble beneath it. A king is not crowned by election alone. A king becomes king the moment he shapes the world in his image. For Bartholomew Roberts, that moment arrived with the quiet certainty of dawn. The morning after his unexpected rise to command, the crew of the Royal Rover expected rum, celebration, and the familiar descent into chaos that followed the appointment of every pirate captain before him. Instead, Roberts stood before them holding a sheet of parchment. No rum, no cheer, only ink, law, and the steady gaze of a man who understood that power without discipline is simply another form of death. These, he said, are our articles. A simple sentence, but it fell upon the deck like cannon iron. The pirates blinked in confusion. Some scoffed, others stared, unsure if he spoke in jest. But Roberts was not a man who joked. Not then, not ever again. He began to read. His voice did not rise or waver. It carried with the calm gravity of a judge passing sentences already written in stone. Article the 1st. Every man shall have a vote in the affairs of the ship, equal rights to provisions, and fair treatment under the law. A murmur of approval. Democracy at sea. Something they understood. Article the 2nd. Any man who steals from the company, even one piece of 8, shall be marooned. The murmurs died. Article the 3rd. No gambling aboard the ship. No drunken quarrels, no waste of ammunition, no disorder that imperils the company. The pirates shifted uneasily. Article the 4th. Lights out at 8, no noise after that hour. A rule unheard of among freebooters. Then came the rule that caused even the bravest among them to turn pale. Article the 6th. No woman or boy shall be allowed aboard. If any man brings one to sea disguised or seduces one, he shall suffer death. Death. Not beating, not dismissal. Death. They looked at Roberts, at the stern stillness in his eyes, the resolve carved into his face, and they understood that he meant every word. Roberts did not create these laws to tame the crew. He created them to tame himself, to build a fortress of order around the grief and chaos within him, to impose on the world the same precision that had once guided his life. One by one, the pirates signed. Some did so reluctantly, some with trembling hands, but all of them signed because something in Roberts commanded obedience in a way no shouting brute ever had. He was not a tyrant. He was not a madman. He was something far more dangerous. He was a man utterly convinced that discipline was the only path to survival, and that certainty radiated from him like heat from iron. By noon, the Royal Rover was no longer a mob of sea wolves following instinct. It was a kingdom, a disciplined machine, a weapon sharpened to the finest edge. That evening, after the ink had dried and the signatures hardened like fate, Roberts descended alone into the quiet of the hold, away from the eyes that looked to him with fear, awe, and expectation. He reached for the silver locket again. Mary's face stared back. A life of warmth, tenderness, and rules whispered gently by the fire, a world that had dissolved into sea foam. He pressed the locket to his chest. "I am sorry," he whispered. Not for the laws he had written, not for the crown he had accepted, but for the distance he felt growing between who he had been and who he was becoming. The world had taken everything from him except his mind, and now he wielded that mind like a blade. He looped the locket's chain around his neck and hid it beneath his shirt, letting the cold metal rest against his heart, a reminder of the man who once believed in quiet order, a reminder of the man he would never be again. When he emerged from the shadows, he was changed. The articles were no longer parchment, they were iron, and he was their embodiment. That night, the crew slept uneasily, the weight of the new laws pressing down on them like a storm they could not see. But Roberts did not sleep. He stood alone on the deck, looking into the endless black of the sea, a sea that had tried to kill him and failed, a sea he now intended to master. For the first time since he had been dragged into piracy against his will, he felt something like purpose. A ship without order is a corpse. A crew without discipline is a sentence of death. A life without rules is an invitation to ruin. He would survive, he would thrive, and he would forge a kingdom built not on rum and chaos, but on structure, fear, and unyielding will. The code of iron had been written, and history would remember it long after the man himself was claimed by the deep. Legends are not born in victory. They emerge in moments when the world watches a single man do the impossible. For Bartholomew Roberts, that moment appeared as a golden giant rising from the sea. The Portuguese treasure ship that drifted into their horizon was not merely a prize, it was a floating citadel. Its masts soared like cathedral towers. Its hull gleamed beneath the sun, laden with riches meant for kings. Gold, ivory, jewels, enough to ransom a nation. Any sane pirate would have turned away. Roberts did not blink. He stood upon the deck of the Royal Rover, composed, silent, observing the Portuguese vessel with the cold analysis of a mathematician. He saw angles, he saw wind, he saw timing, and he saw a victory already carved into the future. He ordered the British ensign raised, a lie fluttering gently in the breeze. The Portuguese captain, convinced of safety, held his course. Roberts waited. Minutes stretched like hours. The crew fidgeted, nervous energy swelling in their chests. But Roberts remained still, his hand resting calmly on the hilt of his sword. At the perfect moment, the kind only a master navigator could calculate, he gave the order. The false colors fell, the black flag rose, a figure standing on two skulls, hourglass in hand. The world would come to know it as the banner of Black Bart. Before the Portuguese crew could react, Roberts unleashed a broadside so precise it seemed less like an attack and more like destiny striking its mark. Cannons roared, iron tore through sail and bone. The great ship shuddered, crippled in moments. As the smoke thinned, Roberts spoke a single word: board. His crew swarmed the enemy vessel, shouting, firing, overwhelming the defenders. But Roberts walked through the chaos like a man on an afternoon stroll, calm, focused, untouched by the frenzy around him. He moved with such composure that even the Portuguese soldiers, bleeding and terrified, found themselves staring at him with something closer to awe than fear. In the great cabin, beneath carvings of saints and angels, they found it. An ornate chest bound in iron. Inside, nestled on velvet, lay a cross of solid gold, as tall as a man's forearm, heavy as sin, and glittering with diamonds that caught the light like frozen stars. A treasure intended for the church, a symbol of divine power. Silence overtook the room. The pirates gazed at the cross as though it were a relic from heaven itself. But Roberts lifted it with no reverence, only quiet contemplation, as if weighing its meaning, not its value. The quartermaster stepped forward. "For you, Captain." Roberts draped the chain over his neck. The cold gold settled against his chest, directly atop the hidden silver locket that held his sister's memory, a symbol of grief buried beneath a symbol of power. In that moment, something in Roberts changed. The locket represented the life he had lost. The cross represented the throne he now claimed. And the clash of those two worlds fused into the figure he would become. From then on, he dressed not as a pirate, but as a sovereign of the sea. Crimson waistcoat, black hat crowned with a red plume, silk and damask captured from fallen ships, and upon his chest the diamond cross, gleaming like a challenge to God himself. He moved across the deck like a phantom wrapped in royal cloth, sipping tea as cannon smoke curled around him. His musicians played solemn hymns during battle, a haunting, unnerving sound that echoed across the water and made enemy crews drop their weapons in fear. No drunken rage, no wild brawls. Roberts fought with logic, with strategy, with a surgeon's calm. He did not conquer by brutality, but by inevitability. Word spread faster than the wind. There was a pirate who fought like a general, who dressed like nobility, who drank tea instead of rum, who approached battle as though attending a funeral, calm, solemn, deadly. And sailors whispered with trembling voices, this one is worse than Blackbeard." For Blackbeard, terrified with spectacle, fire in his beard, smoke curling from his body, a demon conjured from nightmares. But Roberts terrified with composure, a man so unshakably sure of himself that death seemed to circle him without daring to strike. It was fear of a different kind, a deeper kind, a colder kind, the kind that makes nations pay attention. The Royal Rover, once a ship of chaos, had become an empire of order, and at its center stood a man who had buried his grief beneath gold and diamonds, forging an identity that even the sea itself seemed reluctant to challenge. The diamond cross glittered on his chest, the black flag snapped above him, and around the coast of Africa a new legend began to rise. Not of a pirate, but of a king. Power changes a man, but fear, the fear others feel in his presence, transforms him into something else entirely. As the diamond cross rested over Robert's heart, something within him hardened into permanence. He had been a reluctant sailor, then an unwilling captain. Now he began to shape himself into a symbol meant to be remembered, a symbol meant to be feared. He crafted his appearance with the precision of a sculptor chiseling a legend from stone. A crimson damask waistcoat, rich as spilled wine. A hat crowned with a sweeping red plume. Black boots polished to a royal sheen. And always the glittering cross over his chest, catching sunlight like a silent threat. But the most frightening thing about Roberts was not his clothing, it was his composure. Where other captains roared commands, he spoke them as if reciting scripture. Where pirates drank, Roberts sipped tea, the delicate clink of porcelain on deck sounding strange and unsettling amid the rattle of cannon chains. Where others taunted their enemies, he approached each battle with the solemn grace of a man attending a funeral, his enemy's funeral. It was this contrast, the disciplined calm draped in regal crimson, that birthed the title sailors whispered in dim-lit taverns, Black Bart, a man more feared than Blackbeard. For Blackbeard created terror through spectacle. Roberts created terror through certainty. Nothing shook him, nothing angered him, nothing made him hesitate. And that is what terrified the world most. The legend grew quickly when Roberts sailed into Trepassey Harbor, a quiet Newfoundland day dotted with more than 40 ships, each manned by fishermen and modest traders who believed themselves far from danger. The Royal Fortune, for he had renamed his ship in a gesture of sovereignty, glided into the harbor like a wolf stepping into a field of sheep. No cannon fire, no charge, no violence. Roberts stood on deck, crimson waistcoat glowing beneath the cold northern sun, and simply observed. Within minutes, the first ship struck its colors, then another, and another. By midday, 40 ships surrendered without a drop of blood spilled. Men who had never seen battle were reduced to trembling silence by the sight of a figure who moved with the stillness of a man who did not doubt the outcome. Such was the power of Black Bart. But even legends carry ghosts, and Robert's mask, for all its brilliance, was not impervious. It happened aboard the Duchess of Orleans. Roberts expected gold, perhaps silk, maybe wine. What he found was darkness. When the hatches were opened, the stench of suffering rose like a physical force, a depth of human misery so profound that even hardened pirates recoiled. Roberts stood at the edge of the hold, looking down into a world chained in agony. And for a single heartbeat, the mask cracked. In the hollow eyes staring up at him, he saw echoes of the sister he had lost. A grief he had buried beneath discipline and diamond light surged within him, not as compassion, but as a wound torn open. He closed the hatch. "Take the gold," he said quietly. "Leave the rest." It was not mercy. It was not virtue. It was a man refusing to face a mirror he could not bear. That night, Roberts locked himself in his cabin. The musicians were silent, the tea untouched, the crimson coat folded neatly beside him like the skin of a creature he was trying to grow into. He pressed the silver locket to his chest, breathing slowly, deliberately, rebuilding the walls he had spent a lifetime constructing. Above him, the diamond cross glimmered faintly in the lantern light. Wealth over memory, power over pain. When he finally emerged, the mask was flawless again. The regal stride returned. The calm voice resumed its command. The invincible aura settled once more over his shoulders. To his men, he looked immortal. To his enemies, he looked inevitable. To the world, he looked like the future of piracy. But within the quiet chamber of his heart, the locket and the cross pressed together, grief and power fused in a single weight. The crimson mask was complete. A man of iron discipline draped in royal cloth. A man who drank tea while cannons roared. A man who turned harbors into kingdoms with the lift of a hand. A man who carried sorrow like a secret flame behind cold, unwavering eyes. Black Bart Roberts had become something the oceans had never seen before. A pirate not driven by fury, but by precision, by purpose, by the terrible strength of a man who refuses to break. And the world began to fear him, deeply, completely, rightly. Power, no matter how absolute, always breeds a shadow. And in that shadow, resentment grows. For all their fear and respect, Roberts' men were still pirates, men who had once lived under no law but appetite, men who had known the wild thrill of chaos, the roaring joy of unchecked freedom. But Roberts had tamed them. He had carved order into their lives with the precision of a blade. He had buried their chaos beneath structure, discipline, and the cold certainty of consequence. Most obeyed because they wished to live, but some obeyed only because they feared to die. Walter Kennedy was one of the latter. A swaggering brute with more brawl than brains, Kennedy had once reveled under Howell Davis's reckless command. Roberts's silence unnerved him. Roberts's intelligence offended him. Roberts's discipline strangled the life he knew. And resentment, like rot in a ship's hull, spread quietly. It erupted one humid morning off the coast of Africa. A simple game of dice, a pastime Roberts disdained, spiraled into a dispute. Kennedy lost a significant sum and refused to pay the debt, sneering that the articles were nothing but Roberts's chains. The crew froze. A man breaking the articles was one thing. A man challenging the articles themselves was another. Roberts appeared on deck without a word. No raised voice, no dramatic gesture, only the calm presence that had made him king. He looked at Kennedy with the steady gaze of a man who had already calculated every possible outcome. "The law is the life of this ship," Roberts said softly. "You knew the consequence when you broke it." Kennedy spat onto the deck. "Your law," he growled, "not ours." A dangerous murmur rippled through the crew. A test, a moment of fracture, the kind that could end a kingdom. Roberts did not blink. He drew one of his pistols with slow, deliberate grace, the way a judge lifts a pen, not the way a murderer raises a weapon. "You will pay the debt. You will take the lash." Kennedy's jaw tightened. "And if I refuse?" Roberts raised the pistol. "Then you challenge me, and you may claim the captaincy with your life." The silence that followed was suffocating. The crew's eyes flicked between the two men, one seething with anger, the other carved from calm stone. Kennedy's bravado drained away. He saw in Roberts not a man, but an inevitability, a force that could not be swayed by fear, flattery, or fury. He paid. He took the lashes. and Roberts returned to his cabin without another word. The rebellion died before it could take its first breath. But something else died that day as well. The last flicker of comradeship between Roberts and his crew. Their awe deepened into something colder. Their respect became distance. Their obedience became submission. That night, Roberts stood alone at the rail looking over the dark water. The moon cast a pale light over the diamond cross, making it gleam like a star imprisoned in iron. He touched the silver locket beneath it. The crew celebrated quietly below, rum muted by fear, laughter stifled by caution. Roberts heard none of it. In the endless whisper of the waves, he heard only the truth every king eventually learns. Power isolates. Authority demands loneliness. A crown once taken is never shared. He had built an empire from chaos. He had forged men from fear. He had reshaped the oceans themselves through will alone. But he had also built walls around his ship, around his kingdom, and most of all, around his heart. He no longer walked among crewmates. He stood above them, alone upon a throne made of silence. And though the world now whispered his name with dread, though nations plotted his downfall, though even his enemies began to respect him as one respects a storm, Roberts felt the cold truth settle upon him. To rule through iron is to stand alone. And as the night deepened, the king of the sea stared out into the darkness, wondering, not for the first time, whether the ocean had spared him merely to crown him or to consume him in the end. No king reigns without challengers. And when a man rises too high, the world itself conspires to drag him back to earth. By now, Roberts' exploits had become more than rumor. They had become discomforting facts in the ledgers of empires. Portuguese merchants cursed him. Dutch traders feared him. French captains prayed against him. And the British crown, proud, wounded, and humiliated, began to whisper his name with a bitterness reserved only for those who strike too deeply. For Roberts was no longer a pirate. He was a phenomenon, a force that swept across oceans with disciplined efficiency and unnerving calm. Not a wildfire of chaos like so many before him, but a cold, controlled storm. And storms cannot be bribed. They must be broken. A proclamation soon spread across the Atlantic. A general pardon for all pirates except one. Bartholomew Roberts, known as Black Bart, was declared hostis humani generis, enemy of all mankind, public threat of the high seas, the only pirate explicitly excluded from mercy. For him, there would be no forgiveness, only a gallows with a deep. To hunt him, the British Navy commissioned a ship built not for exploration or escort, but for annihilation. HMS Swallow, a 50-gun warship under the command of Captain Cholander Ogle, a man whose pride matched Roberts' precision. And so began the greatest manhunt the golden age of piracy had ever seen. The Swallow scoured the African coast, interrogating traders, bribing informants, shadowing whispers of sightings. But Roberts moved like a chess master, always 3 steps ahead. He blockaded the slave port at Whydah for 11 days, holding an entire fleet hostage, taxing the commerce of empires as if he were a sovereign rather than a pirate. He captured ships with mathematical precision. He extracted wealth with the calm certainty of a king collecting tribute. His crew grew fat with gold. The royal fortune grew heavy with ivory, coin, and cloth, and the legend grew heavier still. But wealth has a way of slowing even the swiftest predators, and arrogance, even the quiet kind, invites fate. One morning, as Roberts' fleet anchored near Cape Lopez, a sail appeared on horizon, a modest silhouette, a ship that seemed afraid. It fled at the sight of Roberts' colors. His men cheered, eager for easy plunder. The smaller ship's retreat felt like an offering, the first meal of the day. Roberts watched through his glass, silent as always. Something in the way the ship tacked, in the crisp precision of its maneuvers, troubled him. No merchantman ran so cleanly. No humble trader caught the wind with such expertise. "He's no merchant," he murmured, but his warning came half a heartbeat too late. For the ship was indeed the Swallow, lying low to lure Roberts' men into overconfidence. Roberts ordered his consort, the Great Ranger, to give chase. They pursued with eager hunger, not knowing they were chasing the hunter. When the Great Ranger drew close, the fleeing ship turned sharply, gun ports flew open, and with a thunderous eruption of cannon fire, the trap was sprung. The broadside shattered the Great Ranger. Men screamed, timbers burst, sea spray mixed with blood. Roberts watched from the deck of the Royal Fortune as half of his strength was captured in a single stroke. The invincible king had been struck. For the first time, his crew saw something in his eyes they had never witnessed before. Not fear, but recognition. The game had changed. The final move was approaching. He gathered his men, their faces pale from the news of the ambush. "They have taken our brothers," he said quietly. "They will return for us, and they believe we will run." He gazed out toward the horizon where the hunter waited. "We will not run." Not a cheer, not a roar, only a heavy silence, the silence of men standing at the edge of destiny. He ordered the anchor cable cut. The Royal Fortune began to glide forward, her black flag rising in the morning wind. No retreat, no escape, only the inevitable confrontation between a king and the empire that sought to claim his crown. Roberts dressed in his finest crimson silk, not as bravado, but as declaration. If he were to fall, he would fall as he had lived, calm, composed, unbroken. And as the Royal Fortune sailed toward the open water, her decks gleaming with polish, her guns loaded, and her crew standing in disciplined ranks, every man felt the truth settle upon them like a final blessing. The hunter had found his prey, but the prey was something else. A king meeting his reckoning. Dawn rose pale over Cape Lopez, its fragile light brushing the sea in hues of silver and ash. The air was unnaturally still, as if the ocean itself held its breath, waiting for the end of something vast. Far beyond the morning haze, a shape emerged, heavy, purposeful, relentless. HMS Swallow. The hunter had returned for the final kill. On the deck of the Royal Fortune, Roberts stood in his crimson waistcoat, the diamond cross gleaming on his chest. His posture was calm, almost contemplative,
not the stance of a hunted man, but the bearing of someone who had accepted the shape of his destiny. He had survived storms, he had outwitted empires, he had carved order into chaos and fashioned a kingdom from fear. But every kingdom must one day confront its undoing. As the Swallow drew near, the crew of the Royal Fortune looked to their captain, not pleading for escape, but for assurance that the man who had carried them through countless perils remained unbroken. Roberts did not need to speak loudly. He never had. "We will show them," he said softly, "how a king meets his end." The words settled upon the men like armor. The Swallow closed in, its gun ports open, its cannons trained, a line of iron teeth ready to bite. Roberts walked the quarterdeck with measured steps, the morning wind tugging gently at his crimson coat. He adjusted the plume on his hat. He straightened the diamond cross. He looked in that quiet moment less like a pirate and more like a monarch preparing for coronation. The first broadside erupted from the Swallow, a violent cough of fire and thunder that tore into the Royal Fortune. Splinters flew, men fell, the deck shuddered beneath the force, but Roberts did not flinch. He paced calmly through the smoke, issuing commands with the same unshaken certainty he had shown from the day he'd first taken command. His voice remained level, measured, a calm center in the chaos. Another volley thundered, this one closer, meaner. And then fate, the silent companion that had followed him since the night of the storm, finally reached out its hand. A blast of grape shot from a swivel gun swept across the quarterdeck. A jagged piece of iron struck Roberts in the throat. No cry, no stumble, no drama. He fell with the quiet dignity of a man lying down to rest. The crimson waistcoat darkened rapidly. The diamond cross shifted to the side, its brilliance catching the last glimmer of morning light. And beneath it, the silver locket, the secret heart he had carried all his life, lay hidden against a silence too vast to measure. The crew froze, not from fear, but from the crushing weight of disbelief. Their captain, the man who had faced storms, navies, betrayals, and fate itself, lay motionless on the deck. The calm at the center of their world had gone still. Roberts's final command, given long before this day, echoed in their memories. "If I fall, you are to cast my body into the sea. Let no man claim me." A king does not kneel. A king is not displayed. A king only returns to his kingdom. They lifted his body with reverent hands, tears and smoke mingling on their faces. But before they could commit him to the deep, another broadside from the Swallow thundered across the water, driving them back, tearing the deck asunder. The men hesitated only a moment. Then, with a desperate act of loyalty, they dragged their captain to the rail and let him slip into the sea. The water closed over him, crimson, gold, and silver, sinking beneath the waves. The ocean, which had spared him once, claimed him at last with a cold, quiet embrace. The Royal Fortune, leaderless and broken, fell soon after. Its survivors were hauled to Cape Coast Castle, where 52 of them were hanged, their bodies tarred and displayed as warnings to all who dared dream of freedom through defiance. Captain Challoner Ogle sailed home triumphant. He was knighted for defeating Black Bart, the only man ever knighted for killing a pirate. But medals tarnish, reports fade, and time forgets those who fought kings. It does not forget the kings themselves. And Bart Roberts had become something more than a man, something more than a pirate. He became a story. And stories, unlike kingdoms of wood and cloth, do not sink. Sailors told of a captain who navigated battle as though guided by prophecy, of a man who fought with calm where others screamed, of a figure in crimson whose diamond cross caught sunlight like a warning, of a pirate whose laws were stricter than any navy's, whose discipline humbled chaos, whose mere presence made hardened men lower their voices. They whispered that Blackbeard was a terror of men, but Black Bart, he was a terror of nations. For Blackbeard sought fear, Bart Roberts became fear. And so long after the deep swallowed his body, long after empires collapsed, long after historians reduced his life to footnotes in aging books, the sea still remembers him. A single name carved into waves, winds, and whispered myths. Black Bart Roberts, the king the ocean made, the ruler fear itself obeyed, the pirate more feared than Blackbeard. And in the endless roll of the tide, his legend sails on, calm, inevitable, and eternal.